The harbor of Tripoli was silent, and that silence was a trap. Somewhere in the darkness, a captured American warship sat chained to the enemy's own guns, and a 25-year-old lieutenant was about to sail straight into the mouth of hell to burn it to the waterline, alone, outnumbered, with no way to retreat if things went wrong. What he did in the next 20 minutes would be called by Britain's own Admiral Horatio Nelson the most bold and daring act of the age, and it would change the course of American naval history forever. This is the story of Stephen Decatur, the USS Philadelphia, and the raid that no one thought could succeed. Before we go further, if stories of naval courage, forgotten wars, and the men who risked everything on the deck of a warship speak to you, stay with me, because this is one of the greatest untold stories in military history, and by the end of this video you will understand exactly why sailors still study this raid more than 2 centuries later. To understand what happened in that harbor, we have to go back to where this war began, and why an American warship was sitting captured in enemy hands in the first place. For decades, the nations bordering the southern shore of the Mediterranean, the Barbary states of Tripoli, Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco, had built their economies on a simple and brutal business model. Their corsair ships, fast and heavily armed, prowled the Mediterranean and the Atlantic approaches, seizing merchant vessels, stealing their cargo, and enslaving their crews. Nations with navies powerful enough to retaliate simply paid tribute, essentially protection money, to keep their ships safe. Weaker nations, or nations without a navy at all, paid the price in captured sailors and lost fortunes. Before the American Revolution, American merchant ships had sailed under the protection of the British flag, and the Royal Navy's power kept the corsairs at bay. But once the United States declared independence, that protection vanished overnight. American ships were suddenly fair game, and the fledgling nation, still finding its feet, did not yet have a navy capable of defending its interests overseas. For years, the United States did what many nations did: paid. Treaties were signed with the Barbary states, and along with those treaties came annual tribute payments, sometimes in cash, sometimes in naval stores, sometimes in outright bribes to individual rulers. It was humiliating, but it was, for a young nation stretched thin and deeply in debt, considered the pragmatic choice. But tribute is never enough for long. The rulers of the Barbary states knew that American trade in the Mediterranean was growing, and they knew that the young republic had no warships to speak of in those waters. So the demands grew. Pasha Yusuf Karamanli of Tripoli, having seized power in his own palace through the murder of his brother, decided that the United States was not paying him enough respect or enough money. In May of 1801, he ordered his soldiers to chop down the flagpole outside the American consulate in Tripoli. In the language of Barbary diplomacy, that single act was a declaration of war. President Thomas Jefferson, who had long argued that paying tribute only encouraged more demands, finally had the political backing to respond with force rather than gold. He dispatched a naval squadron to the Mediterranean, the first real overseas deployment of the young United States Navy, to blockade Tripoli's harbor and protect American shipping. It was the beginning of what history now calls the First Barbary War, and it would prove to be a brutal education for America's infant navy. Among the ships sent to enforce that blockade was the USS Philadelphia, a powerful 36-gun frigate, one of the finest warships America possessed at the time. Under the command of Captain William Bainbridge, the Philadelphia arrived off the coast of Tripoli in the autumn of 1803, tasked with chasing down blockade runners and tightening the noose around the Pasha's harbor. On the morning of October the 31st, 1803, lookouts aboard the Philadelphia spotted a Tripolitan vessel attempting to slip into the harbor. Bainbridge gave the order to pursue, and the frigate turned toward the coastline, closing in on waters that were treacherous, poorly charted, and studded with hidden reefs. It was, in hindsight, exactly the kind of trap the harbor's geography had always threatened to spring on an unwary captain. The Philadelphia struck a submerged reef at full speed. The impact drove the ship hard aground, and no matter what Bainbridge and his crew attempted, the ship would not come free. They tried lightening the vessel, dumping cannon overboard, cutting away the foremast, pumping out water, even attempting to rock the hull loose by running the crew from side to side. Nothing worked. Worse, as the tide continued to fall, the ship heeled over at an angle that made most of her remaining guns useless, pointed uselessly at the sky instead of at the approaching enemy. Tripolitan gunboats, sensing an opportunity that would not come twice in a lifetime, swarmed out from the harbor and began pounding the helpless frigate. With his ship immobilized, listing, unable to effectively return fire, and facing capture or the slaughter of his entire crew, Bainbridge made the agonizing decision to surrender. Before doing so, he ordered the ship's papers burned, the pumps opened to try to scuttle her, and gave commands to spike the guns. But in the chaos, much of this was done imperfectly. The crew, more than 300 officers and sailors, were taken prisoner and marched into brutal captivity in Tripoli, where they would remain for the next 19 months, subjected to hard labor and harsh treatment. Then came the blow that turned a disaster into a national humiliation. Days later, a change in the tide lifted the Philadelphia off the reef. The Tripolitans, realizing what had fallen into their hands, towed the frigate into the safety of Tripoli harbor, anchored her under the protective guns of the city's fortress, and began preparing to repair and refloat her as a warship of their own. For the first time, the Pasha of Tripoli would possess a full-sized American frigate, a ship that could be turned against the very nation that built her, potentially now the single most powerful vessel in the entire Barbary fleet. For the United States Navy, this was catastrophic. Not only had they lost one of their finest ships and hundreds of sailors to imprisonment, they now faced the terrifying possibility of that same ship, armed and manned by the enemy, contesting control of the Mediterranean. The blockade commander, Commodore Edward Preble, understood immediately that this could not be allowed to stand. The Philadelphia had to be dealt with, one way or another, and dealt with quickly, before Tripolitan engineers could make her seaworthy and battle-ready again. This is where the story turns to a young naval officer who had already built a reputation as one of the most fearless men in the American fleet, a man whose name would soon echo through naval history for generations to come. Stephen Decatur was born in 1779 in Maryland into a family with salt water in its blood, his father a naval officer during the Revolutionary War. Decatur joined the Navy as a midshipman in 1798, during the build-up for the quasi-war with France, and rose through the ranks with startling speed, driven by a combination of raw talent, aggressive courage, and an almost magnetic ability to inspire loyalty in the men who served under him. By the time the Philadelphia disaster occurred, Decatur was in command of the schooner Enterprise, a small but nimble vessel that had already distinguished itself in the Mediterranean campaign. When Commodore Preble began searching for a solution to the Philadelphia problem, Decatur did not wait to be asked. He volunteered immediately and without hesitation for what everyone involved understood was likely to be a suicide mission. The plan that emerged was audacious even by the standards of an era that prized audacity in naval warfare. Rather than attempting a conventional attack, which would have meant sailing armed ships directly into a heavily fortified harbor bristling with shore batteries and guarded by the Tripolitan fleet, Decatur proposed something closer to a covert commando raid, 2 centuries before that term would even exist. He would sail into the harbor disguised as a harmless merchant vessel, get close enough to the captured Philadelphia to board her, overwhelm whatever skeleton crew guarded her, set her ablaze, and escape before the harbor's defenses could fully react. To make this possible, the Americans needed a ship that would not immediately draw suspicion. Fortune, or perhaps fate, had already provided one. Weeks earlier, Decatur's own schooner had captured a small Tripolitan vessel, a ketch that had been trading in the region and was intimately familiar in silhouette to anyone watching from Tripoli's shore batteries. The Americans renamed her the USS Intrepid, and the irony of using a captured enemy vessel to destroy the enemy's greatest prize was not lost on anyone involved in the planning. The next task was recruiting a crew willing to sail into what amounted to a fortified enemy harbor with the near certainty that if anything went wrong, there would be no escape, only death or a captivity likely worse than what the Philadelphia's crew already endured. Decatur did not lack for volunteers. Nearly every officer and sailor in the squadron begged to be included, a testament to both Decatur's reputation and the burning desire among the fleet to avenge the humiliation of the Philadelphia's capture. Decatur handpicked a crew of around 70 men, along with a Sicilian pilot named Salvador Catalano, whose knowledge of the harbor and fluency in the local dialects would prove essential to the plan's only real chance of working. The plan called for the Intrepid to sail into Tripoli harbor after dark, flying false colors and posing as a trading vessel that had lost its anchor in a storm and needed to tie up alongside the Philadelphia for the night. A plausible cover story given the region's unpredictable weather. Below decks, the American sailors would remain hidden, armed, and ready, while only a handful of men, dressed to resemble Mediterranean sailors, would be visible on deck. If the ruse held long enough to get the Intrepid alongside the Philadelphia, the hidden boarding party would erupt onto the frigate's deck, overwhelm the Tripolitan guard crew before an alarm could be raised, plant combustibles throughout the ship, set her on fire, and escape back to the Intrepid before shore batteries or the harbor's warships could respond in force. Every element of this plan depended on things that could not be controlled: wind, timing, the alertness of the Tripolitan crew, the willingness of the enemy to be fooled even briefly, and the ability of 70 armed men to remain completely silent and hidden while their small vessel drifted directly beneath the guns of an enemy fortress. There would be no reinforcements. There would be no naval support standing by. If the plan failed at any point, the Intrepid and every man aboard her would likely be captured or destroyed within sight of the very ship they had come to burn. On February the 3rd, 1804, the Intrepid, accompanied by a small support vessel, the Siren under Lieutenant Charles Stewart, set sail from Sicily toward the coast of Tripoli. What should have been a 2- or 3-day voyage turned into an agonizing week-long ordeal, as fierce Mediterranean storms battered the small ketch, threatened to swamp her, and scattered her from the Siren entirely. Men who had volunteered for a daring raid into a fortified harbor now found themselves simply fighting to keep their tiny, overcrowded vessel afloat in mountainous seas, rationing food and water that had never been packed for such a prolonged voyage. Some historians note that the delay, as miserable as it was, may have worked in the Americans' favor, further convincing any observers on shore that a storm-battered vessel seeking safe harbor was exactly what it appeared to be. By February the 16th, the weather had calmed enough, and the Intrepid closed in on Tripoli under the cover of a moonlit but hazy evening. Ahead of them, silhouetted against the fortress walls and the lights of the city, sat the USS Philadelphia, anchored under the guns of the harbor's batteries, her own cannon reportedly loaded and ready in case of exactly this kind of attack. Decatur gave the order to approach slowly, using the wind at a crawl so as not to alarm any watchman aboard the frigate. Below the deck of the Intrepid, dozens of armed sailors lay pressed against the hull in near total silence, weapons at the ready, sweating despite the cold February night, listening to the creak of timber and the lapping of water against the hull, waiting for a signal that might never come if the plan unraveled even slightly. On deck, only a handful of men were visible, dressed in the loose robes and headwear of Mediterranean sailors, doing their best to look bored and unthreatening as the ketch crept closer to the towering silhouette of the captured frigate. As the Intrepid approached, a voice called out from the deck of the Philadelphia, demanding to know the ship's business. Salvador Catalano, the Sicilian pilot, answered in fluent local dialect, spinning the cover story exactly as planned, that the vessel had lost her anchors in the recent storm and needed to tie up alongside for the night until proper mooring could be arranged. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then permission was granted. The Intrepid was allowed to draw alongside the very ship the Americans had come to destroy. As the two vessels came together, a sudden gust or a shift in current pushed the ships slightly apart before lines could be secured. A small mishap that could have unraveled the entire operation in an instant. But rather than panic, the Americans used it. A rope was tossed between the vessels under the guise of pulling the ships back together for proper mooring, and in reality it allowed the Intrepid's crew to physically haul the ketch tight against the frigate's hull, closing the gap that separated a failed raid from a successful one. Suspicion, however, was rising aboard the Philadelphia. Someone on the frigate's deck apparently spotted the anchors still hanging in place on the Intrepid, anchors that should have been lost according to the cover story, and shouted the alarm, screaming that the approaching vessel was American. In that instant, there was no more time for pretense. Decatur roared the order to board, and the trap that had been building in silence for nearly an hour erupted into violent, sudden chaos. Dozens of American sailors surged up from below decks and swarmed over the rails onto the Philadelphia in a single overwhelming rush, cutlasses drawn, pistols in hand, screaming as they came. The speed and ferocity of the assault was, by design, meant to shock and overwhelm rather than allow a prolonged fight, because a prolonged fight was exactly what the Americans could not afford, trapped as they were beneath the guns of an entire hostile harbor. The skeleton crew guarding the Philadelphia, caught almost completely by surprise, had no time to organize an effective defense. Some fought back with what weapons they could grab. Most were killed, wounded, or driven overboard within minutes. Decatur himself led the charge, cutlass in hand, one of the first men over the rail and into the fight. Remarkably, in an action that historians have marveled at for 2 centuries, the entire boarding, fighting, and clearing of the Philadelphia's deck was accomplished in a matter of minutes, and astonishingly, not a single American sailor was killed in the fighting, with only 1 man wounded. It was a testament to the shock value of the surprise assault, the discipline of the boarding party, and, frankly, no small amount of battlefield luck. With the deck cleared, there was no time to celebrate. Every second the Americans remained aboard the Philadelphia increased the risk that the harbor's shore batteries, the anchored gunboats, and the fortress garrison would fully wake to what was happening and bring their full firepower to bear. Decatur's men moved immediately to the next phase of the plan, spreading combustible materials, tar, oil-soaked rags, and prepared incendiary devices throughout the frigate's decks, rigging, and hold, working with the practiced urgency of men who understood that hesitation now could cost every one of them their lives. Fire was set below decks first, then rapidly through the rest of the ship, and within moments the Philadelphia, this once proud frigate of the American Navy, began to burn. Flames raced up through the rigging with terrifying speed, feeding on tar-soaked rope and dry timber, lighting up the night sky over Tripoli harbor in a way that instantly announced to the entire city that something had gone catastrophically wrong for the Tripolitan defenders. As the fire took hold, Decatur gave the order to abandon ship and return to the Intrepid, and here the raid entered its most dangerous phase. The burning Philadelphia, now a towering column of flame, illuminated the harbor almost as brightly as daylight, stripping away the darkness that had protected the Americans on their approach. Shore batteries, gunboats, and the fortress guns, alerted now beyond any doubt, opened fire on the small retreating ketch, which had to navigate its way back out of the harbor under a hail of cannon fire, with the burning frigate serving as a spotlight for every gun in Tripoli. In one of the most dramatic details of the entire operation, the flames from the burning Philadelphia grew so intense and spread so quickly that they began licking at the sails and rigging of the Intrepid herself as her crew scrambled to cast off and row clear, the very fire they had set threatening to consume their own escape vessel before they could put enough distance between themselves and the inferno. Men rowed with everything they had, oars biting into the dark water, while cannonballs from the harbor's batteries splashed around them, sending up columns of white water in the moonlight. Remarkably, despite the ferocity of the bombardment, the Intrepid escaped the harbor almost entirely unscathed, her sails catching what wind there was as she cleared the harbor mouth, leaving behind her a scene that must have seemed almost apocalyptic to anyone watching from the shore. An entire enemy frigate, once the pride of the Tripolitan fleet's ambitions, consumed from bow to stern in roaring flame, lighting the harbor and the surrounding hillsides in a hellish orange glow, until eventually the fire reached the ship's powder stores and the Philadelphia was destroyed in a final, thunderous explosion that echoed across the water. The mission was an unqualified success. The USS Philadelphia, which the Tripolitans had hoped to repair and turn into the flagship of a rebuilt fleet, was gone, reduced to a burned and shattered wreck at the bottom of the harbor, permanently denied to the enemy. Every single American sailor who had sailed into that harbor sailed back out alive. Word of the raid spread through the Mediterranean and across the Atlantic with astonishing speed, and the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Commodore Preble, initially anxious about the fate of his young lieutenant and the volunteers who had sailed with him, was elated at the news of their safe return and the destruction of the Philadelphia. But it was the reaction from an unexpected quarter that truly cemented the raid's place in naval legend. Admiral Horatio Nelson, at that time widely regarded as the greatest naval commander in the world, reportedly described Decatur's raid as the most bold and daring act of the age, extraordinary praise from a man who had commanded some of the most celebrated naval actions in British history and was notoriously difficult to impress. For the young United States Navy, still finding its identity and struggling to prove itself against established European powers who often viewed it with condescension, this praise mattered enormously. It signaled that America's Navy, however small and young, was capable of feats of daring and professionalism that could stand alongside anything the great naval powers of Europe had ever accomplished. The consequences of the raid rippled outward in multiple directions. For Stephen Decatur personally, the mission transformed him almost overnight from a promising young officer into a genuine national hero. Congress promoted him to the rank of captain, making him, at just 25 years old, the youngest officer to hold that rank in the history of the United States Navy up to that point, a record that in many respects has never been matched. He was presented with a ceremonial sword and showered with public acclaim, and his name became known in households across a country hungry for a hero in its first real overseas conflict. For the broader war effort, the destruction of the Philadelphia removed a serious strategic threat and dealt a significant blow to Tripolitan morale and prestige at a critical moment in the conflict. It demonstrated to the Pasha and his allies that the American Navy, despite its youth, was capable of striking directly into the heart of their most protected waters and succeeding. Combined with continued naval bombardments of Tripoli and the remarkable overland campaign led by William Eaton and a small mixed force that captured the city of Derna, the pressure on Pasha Yusuf Karamanli steadily mounted. The First Barbary War would ultimately conclude in June of 1805 with a treaty that, while not entirely favorable to the United States in every respect, secured the release of the imprisoned Philadelphia crew and ended the immediate crisis, marking the first major overseas military success for the young republic and establishing a precedent, however imperfectly enforced in the years that followed, that America would not simply pay endless tribute to hostile foreign powers. The legacy of Decatur's raid extended far beyond the immediate outcome of the war. It became, and remains, one of the defining moments taught in the study of American naval history, cited for generations as a masterclass in deception, precision, courage, and small unit naval action. It shaped the mythology of the United States Navy at a formative moment, giving the young service a legend it could point to when arguing for its own continued growth and investment, at a time when many in Congress still questioned whether America needed a standing Navy at all. Decatur himself would go on to a long and storied career, later commanding forces in the War of 1812 and the Second Barbary War, before his life was cut short in 1820 in a duel with a fellow naval officer, a death that shocked the nation and only deepened the legend that had begun that night in Tripoli harbor. More than 2 centuries later, the raid on the Philadelphia is still studied not just by naval historians, but by military strategists interested in unconventional warfare, deception operations, and small team raids under seemingly impossible conditions. It stands as an early American example of what modern militaries would later formalize as special operations, achieved not with modern technology, but with wooden ships, hidden sailors, raw courage, and a plan built entirely on nerve. What strikes most people encountering this story for the first time is not simply the danger involved, though the danger was immense, but the sheer confidence of a 25-year-old officer who looked at what seemed like an impossible situation, a captured frigate anchored beneath the guns of a hostile fortress in the middle of an enemy harbor, and saw not an insurmountable obstacle, but a problem that could be solved with precision, patience, and absolute nerve. Decatur's raid endures in memory not because it was the largest battle of the Barbary Wars, it was not, but because it captured something essential about how a handful of committed people, moving with total unity of purpose, can accomplish what entire fleets could not. So here is the question I want to leave you with. In an age of overwhelming firepower, satellite surveillance, and massive standing armies, do raids like Decatur's, small, daring, dependent entirely on courage and human ingenuity rather than brute force, still have a place in modern warfare, or does this kind of mission belong only to the age of wooden ships and iron men? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most daring raids in naval history, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from naval, military, and air power history, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.